The doorbell rang at exactly 11:30 at night. I opened it to find my husband's 24-year-old daughter, Sydney, standing on my porch alongside her husband, Terrence. They were dragging 4 massive suitcases behind them. "Dad said we are moving in," Sydney announced, pushing past me without waiting for an invitation. Before I could process the intrusion, she shoved a crumpled piece of paper into my hand. It was a list of demands. Breakfast at 6:30 sharp. No greasy food. Fresh sheets every week. Clean our bathroom every night. Hand wash our work clothes. Iron them, hang them, and never fold them. I looked over at my husband David, who was standing in the hallway. He looked away and said nothing to defend me. I looked back at Sydney, folded the paper, smiled warmly, and simply said, "Okay." Little did they know they had just handed me the perfect weapon to absolutely destroy their entitled lives. My name is Gwen. I am 34 years old, and I work as a senior luxury real estate appraiser. Before I tell you how I legally dismantled my manipulative husband and his greedy daughter, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button, and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who mistook your patience for stupidity. The real war began 8.5 hours after their midnight invasion. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I was standing in my kitchen sipping a cup of black coffee and reviewing property valuation reports on my tablet. The house was quiet until the sound of heavy, angry footsteps echoed down the hardwood stairs. Sydney stormed into the kitchen wearing silk pajamas that I recognized as mine, though I chose not to mention it just yet. Terrence followed closely behind her. Terrence was 26, a tall and arrogant African-American guy who worked an entry-level finance job but walked around with the unearned confidence of a billionaire. He crossed his arms and glared at me. "Where is breakfast?" Terrence demanded, his voice thick with irritation. Sydney tapped her manicured nails against the marble countertop of my kitchen island. "I explicitly wrote down 6:30 for breakfast, Gwen. It is 8 o'clock. Terrence has to be at his firm by 9 and my yoga class starts in 40 minutes. We are going to be late because you could not follow simple instructions. If you are going to be the lady of the house, you need to actually do the work." David walked into the kitchen just in time to hear his daughter dressing me down like a disobedient servant. He poured himself a cup of coffee, keeping his eyes glued to the floor, clearly hoping I would just submit and make the eggs. Instead of moving toward the stove, I calmly locked my tablet, picked up a sleek manila folder from the counter, and slid it across the marble island until it stopped right in front of Sydney. "What is this?" she asked, staring at the folder as if it were a dead insect. "That is your breakfast menu," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Actually, it is your check-in packet. Since you two have decided to make yourselves permanent guests in my home, we need to establish the administrative parameters of your stay." Terrence scoffed, picking up the folder and opening it. His arrogant smirk vanished almost instantly as he read the first page. "What the hell is a short-term lodger agreement?" he snapped. "And why is there an invoice attached for $5,000? Sydney snatched the paper from his hands, her eyes scanning the itemized list. "Luxury concierge fee," she read aloud, her voice rising in pitch. "Daily housekeeping surcharge, premium laundry service." "Gwen, are you insane? We are family. Family does not charge family to live in their house." David finally found his courage and slammed his coffee mug down on the counter. "Gwen, what is the meaning of this? This is inappropriate. Sydney is my daughter. She and Terrence are family. They are staying here to save up. You cannot charge them rent, let alone hand them a $5,000 invoice for making breakfast." I turned my gaze to David, letting the silence stretch to make him shift uncomfortably. "I do not charge family for rent, David. I charge unauthorized tenants for luxury hotel services." I tapped the invoice with my index finger. "You see, Sydney handed me a list last night, requiring early morning chef services, daily maid service, and specialized laundry care. My consulting rate as an appraiser is $250 an hour. I am a very busy woman. If your daughter expects me to dedicate 20 hours a week to acting as her personal domestic staff, she is going to pay my full hourly rate. $5,000 is actually a discount for the first month." David's face turned a shade of red. "You are being completely ridiculous," he yelled, taking a step toward me. "This is my home, and my daughter is welcome here without having to sign a lease or pay your maid fees. I am the man of this house, and I say they stay for free." I did not flinch. I did not back away. I simply looked at him with the cold precision I used to evaluate estates. "Your home?" I asked softly. "That is fascinating, David. Because last time I checked the county records, the deed to this $1 million property is solely in my name. I purchased this house with my own money 2 full years before you put a ring on your finger. You do not pay the mortgage. You do not pay the property taxes. You do not even pay for the insurance. You pay the electric bill and occasionally buy the groceries." Sydney gasped, looking at her father for confirmation. Terrence shifted uncomfortably, realizing the financial dynamic was not what David had led them to believe. I continued, my voice echoing clearly. "I pulled you out of bankruptcy 4 years ago, David. I paid off your debts, I gave you a place to live, and I allowed you to maintain your pride. But do not ever confuse my generosity with ownership. You are a guest here just as much as they are. If your daughter wants someone to iron her clothes, she can hire a maid. If she wants me to do it, she pays the invoice up front. Otherwise, she can figure out how to use the toaster herself." David opened his mouth to argue, but the truth of his financial dependence shut him down. He crumpled the invoice in his fist, threw it in the trash can, and pointed a trembling finger at me. "I forbid you from speaking to my daughter this way," he sputtered. "We are not paying this and they are staying." Sydney crossed her arms, a smug smile returning to her face. Terrence chuckled, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. "Like I said," Terrence muttered, taking a loud bite. "Family stays for free." I looked at the three of them standing united in my kitchen, convinced they had won. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue further. I simply smiled, a genuine smile that made David flinch, and walked out of the kitchen. I headed down the hallway to my home office. I stepped inside, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and sat at my desk. They thought they had secured a free ride in a luxury home. They had no idea I was already setting the trap. I opened my laptop and activated the high-definition security cameras I had discreetly installed in the main hallways and living areas, the same high-end equipment I used to monitor staging materials for luxury property listings. The invasion had begun, but I was going to ensure they paid for every single second they spent in my house. Sitting in the quiet sanctuary of my office, I adjusted the contrast on my primary monitor. The screen split into 4 crisp, high-definition feeds. This surveillance system was not some cheap commercial setup. It was a proprietary, encrypted network I utilized for my luxury appraisal business. When evaluating sprawling estates loaded with fine art and antique fixtures, impeccable visual documentation was non-negotiable. I had hardwired these cameras into the crown molding of my own home last year, after a string of burglaries in our gated community. David knew about the exterior cameras, but he had completely forgotten about the interior ones. He never paid attention to my work or the security measures I implemented. That ignorance was about to become his greatest downfall. Through the screen, I watched the aftermath of my exit play out in the kitchen. Sydney was already pillaging my walk-in pantry. I watched with clinical detachment as she bypassed the standard groceries and reached straight for my top-shelf imports. She pulled out a box of artisanal truffles I had flown in from a boutique in Switzerland and a jar of macadamia nut butter that cost more than her entire outfit. She ripped the packaging open, spilling chocolate crumbs across the pristine white marble floor, and stuffed a truffle into her mouth. Terrence was leaning against the refrigerator, laughing loudly at something David was saying. I cranked up the audio feed. The microscopic microphones picked up every word with terrifying clarity. Terrence bent down, fished my crushed invoice out of the trash can, and smoothed it out on the counter. He read it aloud in a mocking, high-pitched voice, making Sydney burst into obnoxious laughter. $5,000 for concierge services. Terrence snickered, tossing the paper back into the garbage. She really thinks she is some kind of corporate boss in her own house. Man, you really married a piece of work, David. My 50-year-old husband, the man whose bankruptcy legal fees I had paid in full just 4 years prior, nervously rubbed the back of his neck. "Do not worry about Gwen," David told his son-in-law, his voice dripping with forced authority. She gets a little high-strung because of her job. She is stressed. She will calm down by dinner time and realize she was out of line. You two just relax. You are family. You do not need a lease, and you certainly do not need to pay a dime to stay in my house. My house. The sheer audacity of his words echoed through my office speakers. He was promising them a kingdom he did not own. I did not feel angry. Anger is a messy, unpredictable emotion that clouds your judgment and makes you sloppy. In my line of work, precision is everything. A miscalculation of a single square foot can swing a property valuation by tens of thousands of dollars. I applied that same ruthless precision to my current situation. I opened a fresh digital file on my encrypted server and named it Lodger Eviction Protocol. I dragged and dropped the recorded video clip of Terrence tossing the invoice alongside David, actively telling them they did not have to pay. In the state where I lived, establishing a paper trail of refusal to pay for services rendered, or establishing unauthorized tenancy, was step one in a civil damages claim. They were building my legal case for me, and it was not even 9 in the morning. I stood up from my desk, smoothed out my tailored suit jacket, and gathered my briefcase. I had an appraisal scheduled at a massive equestrian estate across town, and my clients paid a premium for my punctuality. Unlocking my office door, I stepped back into the hallway. The laughter in the kitchen abruptly stopped as my heels clicked against the hardwood floor. I walked past the kitchen archway without giving them a single glance. I did not yell about the truffle crumbs on the floor. I did not demand an apology. I remained entirely ice cold. David called out my name, taking a step forward, but I simply walked out the front door and locked it firmly behind me. The drive to the equestrian estate was peaceful. I spent the next 6 hours walking through a breathtaking property, calculating depreciation, assessing custom architectural features, and interacting with wealthy clients who respected my expertise. It was a stark contrast to the leeches currently occupying my home. During my lunch break, I checked the live feed from my phone. Sydney and Terrence had spent the entire morning lounging on my custom-imported Italian leather sofa, eating my food and watching my television. Terrence had put his dirty sneakers directly on the glass coffee table. I took a screenshot. Another piece of evidence for the damages claim. I was playing the long game. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I finished my final report and started the drive back to my neighborhood. I felt a strange sense of calm. I knew exactly who David was now. He was a coward who used my wealth to fund his ego and buy the affection of his spoiled daughter. But as I pulled my car into the driveway, I noticed something strange on my mobile security alert system. The motion sensors in the upstairs hallway had been triggered multiple times over the last hour. I pulled over to the side of the road, keeping my engine running while I opened the live camera feed on my dashboard display. The camera angle showed a massive pile of fabric hangers and expensive silk blouses accumulating right outside the master bedroom door. My heart rate stayed perfectly steady as I zoomed in on the footage. Sydney was walking out of my private bedroom, carelessly tossing my designer shoes onto the hardwood floor. The real conflict was only just beginning, and they were about to escalate their invasion to a level I had fully anticipated. I parked my car in the garage and took a single steadying breath before stepping through the interior door. The house felt entirely different now, heavy with the toxic energy of the parasites occupying it. I placed my keys on the entryway console and walked toward the grand staircase. My footsteps were silent against the thick runner rug. As I ascended to the second floor, the sheer scale of their disrespect came into full view, matching exactly what the camera feed had warned me about. My designer clothes were piled in the hallway like garbage. Silk blouses that required dry cleaning, tailored blazers I wore to high-stakes meetings, and cashmere sweaters were tangled together on the hardwood floor. A pair of limited edition heels had been carelessly tossed against the baseboard, scuffing the paint. It was a calculated display of dominance, a territorial marker left by a petulant child trying to assert control over a woman she desperately envied. I stepped over a pile of my own dresses and approached the master suite. The heavy double doors were pushed wide open. Inside, Sydney was dragging my antique vanity chair across the room to position it in front of the bay windows. She had already set up a massive ring light right next to my king-sized bed. Her suitcases were exploded across the mattress, her cheap, fast fashion garments bleeding over my high thread count duvet cover. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Sydney did not even have the decency to look guilty. She adjusted the angle of her phone on the tripod and flipped her hair over her shoulder. "The guest room is way too dark," she stated, speaking to me as if I were a slightly dim-witted roommate. "The natural lighting in here is just so much better for my TikTok videos. I need the morning sun for my aesthetic. You understand, right?" Before I could step into my own bedroom to gather the rest of my belongings, a heavy hand slammed against the doorframe. Terrence stepped out from the ensuite bathroom, his massive frame deliberately blocking the entryway. He crossed his arms over his chest, puffing out his shoulders in a pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. "Come on, Gwen, you are only 34, Terrence said, offering a patronizing lazy smile. "You can take the guest room. It is not a big deal. Sydney is stressed and we are the actual family here. You need to be accommodating." The actual family. The audacity of this 26-year-old boy standing in a house my money paid for, telling me my place in the hierarchy was almost impressive in its delusion. He honestly believed his marriage to David's daughter granted him ultimate authority over my assets. I did not back away from him. I held my ground, looking him dead in the eye until his arrogant smile faltered slightly under my unwavering gaze. "Where is David?" I demanded, my tone slicing through the air like shattered glass. "Right here," David mumbled, emerging from the guest room down the hall. He looked like a cornered animal shifting his weight from foot to foot. He had clearly been hiding, hoping Terrence would handle the confrontation for him. I turned my attention entirely to my husband. I pointed at the pile of expensive fabrics suffocating the hallway floor. "Did you authorize this, David? Did you tell your daughter she could drag my personal property out of my bedroom so she could film social media videos?" David cleared his throat, trying to summon a commanding tone that failed miserably. "Gwen, listen to me. The guest room bed is perfectly fine for now. Sydney needs the extra space, and the lighting in the master suite really is better for her content creation. It is just temporary until they get back on their feet." I took a slow, measured step toward him. "I pulled you out of bankruptcy 4 years ago," I said, making sure every syllable hit him with maximum impact. "When the bank was coming for everything you had, when your so-called real family turned their backs on you, I paid your legal fees. I paid off your debts. I gave you this luxury roof over your head. Is this how you repay me? By letting your daughter trash my belongings and throw me out of my own bedroom." Instead of showing an ounce of shame, David immediately resorted to his favorite defensive tactic. He began to gaslight me, twisting the narrative to make himself the noble protector and me the heartless villain. "Keep your voice down." David snapped, his face flushing red. "You do not understand what is going on. Sydney might be pregnant. We do not know for sure yet, but she is showing signs. She is exhausted. She needs comfort right now, and the master suite is the only room with a soaking tub. You are being incredibly selfish, Gwen. You care more about your stupid clothes and your master bathroom than you do about your own stepdaughter's well-being." A potential pregnancy. It was the ultimate manipulative trump card played specifically to force me into submission. If I argued against a potentially pregnant woman, I would automatically be branded a monster. I analyzed his body language. His eyes darted away. His breathing was shallow, and his hands were tucked into his pockets. He was lying, or at the very least severely exaggerating a convenient excuse Sydney had fed him to get what she wanted. I looked past David to Terrence, who was suddenly looking highly uncomfortable at the mention of a pregnancy. I looked at Sydney, who was busy reapplying lip gloss in the reflection of her phone, showing absolutely zero signs of exhaustion or morning sickness. They were parasites draining the lifeblood of my sanctuary, using guilt and imaginary children as their weapons. I could have screamed. I could have threatened to call the police to remove them for trespassing, but the police would simply declare it a civil domestic dispute because David was legally my husband. Creating a chaotic scene would only give David exactly what he wanted. He needed me to act hysterical. He needed me to scream and throw things so he could point his finger and tell everyone I was mentally unstable. I remembered the audio recording from the security cameras early that morning. He was searching for any excuse to gain medical power of attorney over me. I absolutely refused to hand him that ammunition. "You are right, David," I said smoothly, my voice dropping to a calm, soothing cadence that completely derailed his defensive momentum. "If Sydney might be pregnant, she certainly needs the soaking tub. Stress is terrible for the first trimester." David blinked, caught entirely off guard by my sudden capitulation. Terrence let his arms drop from across his chest, exchanging a confused look with Sydney. They had geared up for a massive screaming match, a reality television-style brawl over the bedroom. By refusing to fight them, I completely neutralized their strategy. I reached down and calmly gathered an armful of my discarded silk blouses. "I will just take the rest of my things into the guest room," I continued, offering David a placid smile. "Please make sure Sydney rests." I walked past them carrying my ruined clothes down the hall toward the guest suite. I closed the door quietly behind me. The moment the latch clicked into place, my pleasant facade vanished, replaced by an ice-cold determination. I set my clothes on the guest bed and immediately grabbed my secure lockbox from the bottom of my travel bag. I transferred my most sensitive documents, my jewelry, and my backup hard drives into the safe. Let them have the master bedroom. Let them revel in their stolen luxury and their fake pregnancies. They were celebrating a hollow victory in a war they did not even realize they were fighting. I pulled out my laptop and opened the network control dashboard. They wanted to play territorial games with my house, so I was going to cut off their lifelines one by one. The master bedroom was about to become the most uncomfortable place on earth. My fingers flew across the keyboard with the same detached speed I used when submitting high-value valuation reports to corporate lenders. The guest room was small, but it was structurally sound, and most importantly, the lock was a heavy commercial-grade deadbolt that required a physical key only I possessed. I placed my laptop on the wooden desk by the window. Outside, the evening shadows were stretching across the manicured lawn, swallowing the twilight. I looked at the screen, my expression perfectly flat, devoid of the anger they expected me to show. Sydney wanted luxury, and David wanted to play the generous patriarch at my expense. They truly believed that by physically occupying the master bedroom, they had won some grand territorial victory. They did not understand that in modern society, the real power does not belong to the person sleeping in the biggest bed. It belongs to the person who holds the account credentials. I logged into the administrative portal for our fiber optic internet provider. When I purchased this house, I had a dedicated corporate line installed boasting 2 gigabits of symmetrical upload and download speed. It cost $300 a month, a premium expense that I paid exclusively from my private business account because my appraisal software required massive data transfers for 3-dimensional property rendering and high-resolution aerial maps. Sydney relied on this high-speed connection to upload her high-definition videos, stream her high-resolution content, and scroll through social media feeds for hours on end. I navigated to the Network Plan Management tab. With 3 rapid calculated clicks, I downgraded the entire household connection to the absolute lowest tier. Available a basic starter plan offering just 10 megabits per second of download and a miserable 1 megabit of upload. It was a speed barely capable of loading a text-based web page, let alone streaming high-definition video content or hosting a live broadcast. Next, I targeted the entertainment system. I opened the premium streaming and cable service control dashboard. David loved spending his weekends sitting in the master bedroom watching live sports broadcasts in high definition on the 70-inch smart television I had bought for him on his birthday last year. Sydney and Terrence had already brought their own premium streaming devices to plug into my hardware, expecting to hijack my accounts. I checked the active packages. I systematically unsubscribed from every premium channel, every sports network, and every entertainment add-on. I canceled HBO Showtime and the local sports packages. Within minutes, the television in the master suite would display nothing but a standard low-resolution basic channel guide. If they wanted entertainment, they would have to talk to each other in the dark. If Sydney wanted to upload her videos to build her online aesthetic, she would have to wait hours for a single 30-second clip to process. I paid every single utility bill from my own personal corporate account, so I had every legal right to adjust the level of service as I saw fit. I closed the utility portal and opened my encrypted browser tab to access my online banking. This was where the real surgical incision would be made. 4 years ago, when David was drowning in debt after his real estate investment firm went under, I stood by him. I did not just offer emotional support. I took $45,000 out of my personal liquid assets to clear his remaining high-interest lines of credit so his credit score would not be permanently ruined. He had been incredibly grateful at the time, promising that we would build a shared future. Out of a misplaced sense of marital unity, I had agreed to open a joint checking account. Over the last 3 years, that account had become David's personal safety net. Because his income as an independent broker was volatile and sparse, I was the one who funded 90% of that account, depositing a fixed portion of my appraisal fees into it every single month to cover general household expenses. David used that account to pay the electric bill, maintain his vehicle, and apparently to fund the extravagant lifestyle of his 24-year-old daughter. I logged into the joint portal and checked the current balance. It stood at $45,320. Most of that money had come from a massive corporate valuation project I had wrapped up the previous week. I opened the transfer tab. I initiated a direct wire transfer, moving exactly $45,270 out of the joint account and into my private offshore linked corporate savings account. I left exactly $50 in the balance. $50 was just enough to prevent the bank from closing the account automatically due to a zero balance, but it was completely useless for any significant transactional activity. I knew exactly what would happen next. David had set up automatic payments for his personal credit cards, his luxury car lease, and Sydney's premium cell phone plan to draw directly from that joint checking account. Those payments were scheduled to process over the next few days. With only $50 remaining, every single automatic withdrawal would trigger an insufficient funds bounce, hitting his account with consecutive bank penalties and instantly alerting his creditors. He had arrogantly told his daughter that they could live here entirely for free, assuming my money would continue to quietly cushion their entitlement. He believed I would remain silent to maintain peace in our marriage. He had no idea the financial floor had just vanished beneath his feet. I shut my laptop screen and locked it inside my secure desk drawer. The profound silence in the guest suite was incredibly comforting. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of Sydney complaining downstairs that her feed was buffering. Let them enjoy the stolen room with no money and no internet. The real revenge game was only just beginning right now. It did not take long for the consequences of my digital blackout to ripple through the house. Less than 30 minutes after I locked myself in the guest suite, the muffled sounds of Sydney complaining escalated into a full-blown tantrum. Her shrill voice carried up the grand staircase and seeped under my heavy oak door. She was screaming that her video upload had failed 3 times, and that she could not even load a basic social media feed. Terrence chimed in his deep voice, grumbling about how his online gaming server had completely dropped him from a match. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. A fist hammered against my door. "Gwen, open up," David shouted, twisting the brass doorknob aggressively. "Something is wrong with the router. The kids cannot get online and the television in the master bedroom is entirely frozen. Fix it right now." I remained seated at my desk, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not make a sound. I let him pound on the solid wood, letting his frustration hit a brick wall. I knew that engaging with him would only validate his false sense of authority. "Gwen, I know you are in there," David yelled, his voice cracking with artificial dominance. "You cannot just lock yourself away and ignore your family. Turn the network back on. We need it." I simply adjusted the volume on my encrypted monitoring display, ensuring I could hear him perfectly, without ever having to respond. After 10 minutes of futile yelling and rattling the locked handle, David finally gave up. I heard him stomp back down the hall, muttering curses under his breath, promising Sydney he would call the utility company first thing in the morning to demand an override. I smiled at that thought. He could call them all he wanted. Without the security pin and my social security number, customer service would not even confirm the account existed. The house eventually fell quiet, but I did not sleep. In my profession, patience is a highly cultivated skill. You do not close a multi-million-dollar appraisal by rushing the paperwork. You sit, you observe, and you gather undeniable evidence. I kept my eyes fixed on the split-screen monitor, watching the infrared feeds cycle through the empty hallways and the dark kitchen. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the motion sensor on camera 4 flashed a silent red warning on my screen. I leaned forward. The camera was positioned in the ceiling molding above the kitchen island, offering a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire room. The refrigerator door swung open, casting a pale, unnatural light across the marble floor. Terrence stood there, pulling out a bottle of imported sparkling water. Sydney slipped into the frame a second later, wrapping her arms around herself in the dark. David followed them, pulling out a chair at the island. They did not turn on the overhead lights. They were acting like thieves in the night. I activated the high-gain audio enhancement feature on the camera interface. The microscopic microphones filtered out the ambient hum of the refrigerator, isolating their voices and amplifying them with terrifying clarity. "This internet thing is a disaster," Sydney whispered, her tone completely devoid of the hysterical performance she had put on earlier. "I cannot live like this for a month, Dad. She is doing this on purpose to freeze us out." Terrence unscrewed the cap of the water bottle and took a long drink. "You just need to keep your focus, Sydney," he said, his voice low and calculating. "Do not let her get under your skin. We stick to the timeline." I pressed the record button on my software, making sure the timestamp and audio levels were perfectly logged. "The lawyer said 30 days," Sydney muttered, leaning against the counter. "If we stay past 30 days, we get squatters' rights. We establish permanent residency. Once we hit that mark, she cannot legally evict us without a court order, and the courts in this state are backed up for months. We will have complete run of this mansion, and she will be the one forced to leave her own property." A cold chill radiated down my spine. Squatters' rights. The legal concept of adverse possession and tenant rights established through unauthorized but unchallenged occupancy. This was not a case of a spoiled daughter wanting a free vacation. This was a premeditated, legally advised strategy to seize possession of my $1.2 million asset. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the marble island. "We just have to play it smart," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The internet is annoying, but it is a minor hurdle. We have to keep pushing her buttons. We need her to react. If she screams, if she gets violent, or if she completely breaks down, that is our golden ticket." "What do you mean?" Terrence asked. "I spoke to my own attorney last week," David explained, confirming my absolute worst fears. "If I can prove she is mentally unstable, if I can document that she is a danger to herself or losing her grip on reality, I can file for a medical proxy. I can get power of attorney over the entire estate. I am her legal husband. If she is declared unfit, I gain total control of her assets, her bank accounts, and this house." Sydney giggled softly in the dark. "So we just drive her crazy. That should be easy. She is already halfway there, hiding in that guest room. We keep applying pressure," David confirmed. "We make her look unhinged. When the time is right, I will call the police for a wellness check. Once I have that power of attorney, I can transfer the deed into a shared trust, and we secure our future permanently." I sat perfectly still in the dark glow of my monitor. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously evil that it completely bypassed my emotional centers and triggered a state of pure clinical survival. My husband was not just defending his entitled daughter. He was actively plotting to gaslight me, have me declared legally incompetent, and steal my entire net worth. This was a coordinated heist. I watched them wrap up their midnight meeting and sneak back upstairs to the master bedroom. They thought they were brilliant. They thought they had cornered a stressed, exhausted woman who would eventually crack under the weight of their psychological warfare. But they had fundamentally misjudged their target. I was not a fragile housewife. I was a senior luxury real estate appraiser. I dealt with ruthless corporate developers, hostile negotiations, and multi-million-dollar legal disputes every single day. I knew the law better than their cheap consulting attorneys ever would. I securely saved the video and audio files to 3 separate encrypted cloud drives. Then I transferred a copy onto an external hard drive and locked it in my safe. I opened my secure email client and drafted a high-priority message to Mitchell, my private wealth management attorney. I attached the audio clip and requested an emergency meeting. They wanted to play a high-stakes legal game for my property, and I was going to ensure their absolute ruin. The trap was set, and they were walking right into it. I woke up feeling remarkably rested. Knowing the exact parameters of your enemy's strategy completely removes the anxiety of the unknown. I showered, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, and pinned my hair back with absolute precision. When I unlocked my door and stepped into the hallway, the house felt heavy with their hostile presence. I could hear David in the kitchen trying to placate Sydney over the abysmal internet speed, promising her he would handle my behavior today. I walked past the kitchen without a glance, heading straight for my home office. I had a morning full of property evaluations to finalize, and I needed to prepare for my emergency meeting with Mitchell later that afternoon. The silence I maintained was clearly infuriating them. They needed a reaction. They needed a breakdown to fuel their legal narrative. Around 11 o'clock, I was reviewing a commercial real estate contract when a tremendous crash echoed through the main corridor. The sound of shattering porcelain and splintering wood vibrated through the floorboards. I saved my document, pushed my chair back, and walked toward the noise with measured steps. The hallway outside the formal dining room was a disaster zone. Scattered across the polished mahogany floor were the shattered remains of a rare Ming Dynasty vase. It was an authentic 16th century piece I acquired during an estate liquidation 3 years ago. Its delicate blue and white porcelain shards now lay mixed with the broken pieces of the custom display pedestal that had held it. The vase was fully insured and officially appraised at exactly $15,000. Terrence stood right in the middle of the wreckage, brushing dust off his expensive sneakers. Sydney was leaning against the wall, holding her phone, clearly ready to hit record the moment I started screaming. David rushed out of the master suite, his eyes darting between the broken antique and my face, waiting for the explosion he desperately needed for his medical proxy case. I stopped at the edge of the debris and looked at the broken porcelain. Then I looked up at Terrence. He puffed out his chest, stepping over a large shard of priceless ceramic with careless arrogance. The wind blew the window open and knocked it over, Terrence said, his voice dripping with condescension. He pointed to a window at the far end of the hall that was barely cracked open. It was just a gust of wind, Gwen. Cheap junk anyway. You really should not leave fragile trash sitting around in the hallway where people have to walk. It is a safety hazard for Sydney. David stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture that was entirely performative. Now take it easy, Gwen, David warned, using that slow, condescending tone reserved for psychiatric patients. Do not have a meltdown over a stupid pot. It was an accident. If you start screaming and throwing a fit over a piece of cheap clay, I will have to call someone to come check your mental state. You have been very unstable lately. Sydney held her phone higher, the camera lens pointed directly at my face. They were practically begging me to lose control. They wanted tears. They wanted rage. They wanted me to drop to my knees and mourn the loss of a $15,000 artifact so they could paint me as dangerously materialistic and unhinged. I looked at the broken vase, then up at Terrence, and let a soft, completely relaxed smile spread across my face. You are right, I said, my voice light and entirely cheerful. Accidents happen. It is just a thing. I turned around and calmly walked back to my office. I heard David exhale loudly in the hallway, clearly frustrated that his trap had failed to spring. Sydney muttered something about me being a total freak, and Terrence laughed, kicking another piece of porcelain against the wall. I stepped into my office, locked the heavy door, and walked straight to my surveillance monitors. I rewound the high-definition feed from camera 2, which covered the exact section of the hallway where the pedestal stood. I played the footage back in glorious 4K resolution. The video showed Terrence walking down the hall, stopping directly in front of the vase. He looked around to make sure the hallway was empty, completely unaware of the lens hidden in the molding above him. He deliberately placed his hands on the heavy wooden pedestal and shoved it hard to the right. The entire structure toppled over, sending the Ming vase crashing into the floor. There was no wind. There was no accident. It was a calculated act of vandalism designed specifically to provoke a hysterical reaction from me. I clipped the video file, ensuring the timestamp was perfectly legible. I opened my secure floor safe and retrieved a fireproof envelope containing my most valuable physical documents. I pulled out the official certificate of authenticity and the certified appraisal document for the Ming vase, both bearing the official seal of a master antiquities appraiser. The documents clearly stated the replacement value at $15,000. I scanned the physical documents into high-resolution digital files. I opened my encrypted email and drafted a new message to my lawyer, Mitchell. I attached the security footage showing Terrence intentionally destroying the asset, along with the official valuation certificates. The subject line of the email was simple: civil damages and criminal mischief evidence. Terrence worked in the financial sector, an industry that relies heavily on impeccable background checks. A civil lawsuit for fraud and destruction of property would trigger an immediate red flag with his compliance department. He thought he was untouchable because he was married to my husband's daughter. He did not realize he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to obliterate his professional career. This was not just about a broken vase, it was about exposing their reckless entitlement. I smiled as I hit send, knowing the trap was perfectly set. 20 days into their unauthorized residency, Sydney and Terrence decided to escalate their territorial display. I was sitting in my locked office reviewing an appraisal for a commercial high-rise downtown when the heavy bass of electronic music began vibrating through my floorboards. It was a Saturday afternoon. I pulled up my exterior camera feeds. My pristine backyard had been transformed into a chaotic playground. Sydney was throwing a lavish pool party. Dozens of people were swarming my travertine patio. I recognized none of them, but their uniforms gave them away. They were Terrence's finance buddies, young men with slick haircuts, expensive sunglasses, and the same unearned swagger that my son-in-law carried. They were lounging on my custom outdoor furniture, spilling drinks on the imported cushions, and acting as if they owned the estate. A massive catering spread was being set up near the outdoor kitchen, featuring towering platters of seafood premium steaks and an open bar. Sydney was parading around the pool deck in a designer swimsuit, playing the role of the wealthy hostess, while David stood near the grill, desperately trying to look like the generous patriarch funding the entire spectacle. I knew exactly what this was. This was a psychological pressure test. They wanted to flood my sanctuary with strangers, violate my personal boundaries, and force me out of hiding. They needed me to march out there, scream at the guests, and demand that everyone leave. They wanted a public meltdown, a documented incident of hostility that David could add to his imaginary file of my mental instability. I refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead of staying locked away, I decided to make an appearance on my own terms. I needed to retrieve a file from my vehicle parked in the detached garage, which required me to walk directly through the patio area. I checked my reflection in the mirror, smoothing down my tailored linen trousers and crisp white blouse. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water with a slice of lemon, taking a slow, steadying breath. I stepped out of my office and walked toward the sliding glass doors that led to the patio. The moment I slid the heavy glass door open, the atmosphere shifted. A few of the finance bros standing near the entrance stopped talking and stared. I did not break my stride. I walked with the absolute authority of a woman who held the deed to every single brick and blade of grass on the property. I navigated through the crowd, my expression completely neutral, sipping my sparkling water, as if these people were nothing more than ghosts haunting my garden. Sydney spotted me from across the pool. I saw her eyes light up with malicious excitement. She grabbed the arm of a particularly loud guy, holding a craft beer, and marched directly into my path, forcing me to stop. "Hey, everyone!" Sydney announced, raising her voice so it carried over the pulsing music. Several of the guests turned to look. "I want to introduce you to someone. This is Gwen. She is my dad's temporary wife." I looked at her, my face perfectly blank. A few of the guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure if it was a joke. Sydney leaned in, dropping her voice to a loud stage whisper that was clearly meant for the entire patio to hear. "She is a bit mentally unwell, so we had to move in to take care of her. It has been a real burden on my dad, but family steps up when people lose their grip on reality, right?" The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. She was weaponizing the false narrative they had plotted in the dark, testing it out in front of a live audience. She wanted me to snap. She wanted me to throw my water in her face and scream that it was my house. I simply took a slow sip of my drink, the bubbles crisp and cold against my tongue. Terrence pushed his way through the crowd to stand beside his wife, wrapping a protective arm around her waist. He looked at me with pure disdain, emboldened by the presence of his coworkers. "Do not mind Gwen, guys." Terrence laughed, addressing his finance buddies with a mocking grin. "She is just a gold digger who failed. Tried to lock down the family wealth but could not handle the pressure. Now we just let her wander around while we handle the grown-up business." A chorus of harsh, cruel laughter erupted from his group of friends. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and amusement, fully buying into the story of the pathetic, unstable woman clinging to her wealthy husband's estate. David was standing by the outdoor kitchen, watching the entire exchange. He looked away, too cowardly to participate directly, but entirely willing to let his daughter and son-in-law publicly humiliate me. I stood there in the center of my own backyard, surrounded by strangers laughing at my expense. I looked at Terrence's smug face, then at Sydney's triumphant smile. I did not feel humiliated. I felt a profound electric sense of anticipation. They thought they were humiliating me, but they were actually signing their own financial death warrants. I knew something they did not. I knew that the massive catering spread sitting behind them had not been paid for yet. I knew that David was planning to settle the final bill at the end of the party using his debit card, the same debit card connected to the joint account I had completely drained 3 weeks ago. I did not defend myself. I did not scream about my ownership of the estate. I looked Terrence in the eyes and offered a polite, chilling smile. "Enjoy the party," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly controlled. "Make sure you try the seafood. I hear it is very expensive." I turned on my heel and calmly walked away without ever looking back. I walked back into the detached garage, retrieved the property evaluation file from my dashboard, and returned to my office through the side entrance of the house. The heavy thumping of the pool music continued to rattle my windows, but I sat at my desk and pulled up the live feed of the outdoor kitchen. The party had been raging for another hour, and the atmosphere was reaching its peak. Plates were piled high with half-eaten lobster tails, and empty champagne bottles littered the stone countertops. David was laughing, holding a glass of scotch, entirely convinced that his performance as a wealthy, hospitable patriarch was cementing his status in front of Terrence's upwardly mobile friends. At exactly 5 o'clock, the head caterer, a stern-faced woman holding a digital tablet with the final invoice, approached David. The music did not stop, but the camera feed zoomed in perfectly on David's confident posture. The total bill for the luxury, spread, the premium open bar, and the staff service came out to exactly $1,200. David gave the caterer a dismissive, patronizing nod. He reached into his leather wallet and pulled out his gold debit card, the exact card tied to the joint checking account that I had drained down to $50 3 weeks ago. He slid the card through the caterer's mobile card reader with a flourish, not even looking at the screen. There was a tense 5-second pause. The card reader emitted a sharp, high-pitched error beep. The caterer frowned, looking at the screen, and then handed the reader back to David. "I am sorry, sir." The caterer's voice cut through the background noise on the audio feed. "The transaction was declined. Insufficient funds." David's smug smile instantly vanished. He blinked, staring at the digital screen as if it were written in a foreign language. "That is impossible." David stammered, his voice suddenly losing its booming authority. "There must be a glitch with your machine. Try it again. There is plenty of money in this account." The caterer ran the gold debit card a second time. The machine beeped sharply again. "Still declined, sir," she said, her tone growing colder, more professional, and significantly louder. "Do you have another form of payment?" Sydney and Terrence noticed the commotion and walked over to the outdoor kitchen island, their friends watching curiously from the pool edge. "What is the holdup, Dad?" Sydney asked, her voice laced with sudden irritation. "The guests are waiting for the dessert course." "It is just a temporary banking issue," David muttered, his forehead beginning to glisten with sweat. He reached back into his wallet, pulled out his primary personal credit card, and handed it over. The caterer swiped it. The machine buzzed instantly. Declined. David's credit card payment had bounced because his automatic luxury car lease withdrawal had hit the remaining $50 days ago, triggering an immediate freeze from his credit card company. David tried a second credit card. Declined again. Terrence, noticing his finance colleagues whispering and staring from the patio, stepped forward aggressively. He pulled out his own corporate credit card, determined to show off his financial power in front of his peers. "Let me handle this," David Terrence said loudly, ensuring his buddies could hear him. "My firm's account has an unlimited cap. Your local bank must be having an outage." Terrence handed his card to the caterer with an arrogant smirk. She dipped the chip into the reader. The machine let out the exact same error beep. Terrence froze. He snatched the reader away to look at the display. The card was declined because his personal bank account had just been hit with consecutive penalties from his own bounced premium cell phone plan. The compliance department at his financial firm had already flagged his account for suspicious activity due to the consecutive failed withdrawals. "This is a joke!" Terrence yelled, his face turning a deep angry crimson as he stared at the caterer. "Run it again. My card does not decline. I am not running anything again until I see guaranteed funds," the caterer stated firmly, her voice echoing across the entire pool deck. "If this $1,200 invoice is not settled in cash or a verified wire within the next 10 minutes, my staff is packing up the remaining food, locking the bar, and we will be leaving with the equipment." A wave of intense, suffocating silence fell over my backyard. The electronic music suddenly felt incredibly awkward. Terrence's finance buddies were openly whispering, snickering behind their hands, and exchanging mocking glances. The grand illusion of Sydney's wealthy lifestyle and Terrence's financial dominance had shattered completely in front of the very people they desperately wanted to impress. Sydney looked like she wanted to vomit, her hands shaking as she stared at her husband. I stood by my office window, looking down at the spectacle through the glass, entirely unbothered, sipping my sparkling water. David looked up toward my window, his eyes wild with desperation. He knew I was in the house. He knew that with one single phone call, or by walking out there with my black Amex card, I could save him from the absolute highest level of public humiliation he had ever faced. He walked toward the back door, pounding on the glass, silently begging me to step in to play the submissive wife and fund his embarrassment. I met his desperate gaze through the window, offered a cool, untroubled smile, and pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut, completely blocking him out. I refused to spend a single dime to salvage his ego. Left with absolutely no options, David was forced to walk back to the patio island, completely broken. The proud patriarch was reduced to an absolute beggar. He cleared his throat. His shoulders slumped as he faced his daughter's affluent friends. "Listen, everyone," David said, his voice cracking under the weight of the intense public shame. "We are experiencing a major corporate banking glitch today. If everyone could just pitch in $50, we can settle the catering bill, and I will wire you the money back first thing on Monday morning." The humiliation was absolute. Sydney covered her face and fled into the house, crying tears of raw rage. Terrence stood by the bar, unable to look his coworkers in the eye, knowing his professional reputation among his peers was completely destroyed. They had moved into my home to strip me of my power, to drive me out and establish squatters' rights. Instead, they were currently begging strangers for grocery money on my patio. I sat back down at my desk, filled with a sharp clinical focus. The financial floor had dissolved beneath them, and the real legal reckoning was only hours away. The aftermath of the spectacular humiliation on the patio unfolded exactly as I anticipated. Terrence's finance colleagues practically sprinted to their luxury vehicles, eager to escape the suffocating embarrassment of the declined credit cards. The catering staff packed up their silver chafing dishes and premium seafood with angry, rapid efficiency, leaving the backyard in a state of absolute dead silence. David, Terrence, and Sydney retreated into the house like beaten dogs, locking themselves in the master suite to hide from the reality of their complete financial failure. I gave them 2 full hours to stew in their shame before I finally unlocked my office door and stepped out into the cool evening air to inspect the damage. The patio was a disaster zone of spilled cocktails and discarded napkins, but I ignored the mess. My focus was on securing the perimeter. I walked straight to the large industrial recycling bins near the side gate. David had hastily shoved several dark plastic garbage bags into the primary recycling bin, completely ignoring the neighborhood waste sorting protocols in his rush to hide the evidence of his ruined party. I opened the heavy lid to reorganize the bins, acting purely out of my ingrained domestic routine. That was when a thick, heavy-duty cardboard FedEx envelope caught my eye. It was wedged awkwardly between 2 empty liquor boxes, torn jaggedly down the middle, as if someone had tried to destroy it in a panicked hurry. The bright logo on the corner of the cardboard belonged to a major national bank. It was a premier lending institution, one I dealt with frequently in my line of work evaluating luxury commercial assets. David had absolutely zero business receiving express courier packages from a top-tier mortgage lender. I pulled the envelope free from the garbage. Inside the cardboard sleeve, a thick stack of legal-sized paper had been ripped into dozens of uneven pieces and shoved back inside. My heart rate remained perfectly steady, but a sharp predatory instinct flared to life in my chest. I tucked the torn envelope tightly under my arm, walked back into the quiet house, and returned straight to my locked office. I cleared my large mahogany desk, turning on the high-intensity drafting lamp I typically used for reviewing intricate architectural blueprints. I dumped the torn paper fragments onto the smooth wood surface. It was a puzzle, and as an appraiser, I am exceptionally good at piecing together broken puzzles. For the next hour, I sat in absolute silence, carefully matching the jagged edges of thick parchment paper, using clear tape to bind the pieces back together into legible documents. As the first page took shape under the bright light, my professional expertise immediately identified the standardized formatting. It was a uniform residential loan application. My eyes scanned the borrower information block. There was David's name listed clearly as a co-applicant. But the primary applicant, the alleged sole owner authorizing the massive financial transaction, was me. I pieced together the second page, then the third, moving with cold mechanical precision. The picture became terrifyingly clear. This was not a standard personal loan. It was an application for a home equity line of credit, commonly known in the real estate industry as a HELOC. The requested draw amount, printed in bold black ink, was a staggering $500,000. The property listed as the primary collateral securing the massive loan was my $1.2 million estate. My mind raced, connecting the dots with the audio recording I had captured from the kitchen the previous night. The squatters' rights scheme and the medical proxy plot were just their backup plans. This HELOC was their primary objective. David knew he could not easily force me to sign over the deed to the house without a brutal, drawn-out legal fight in divorce court. But if he could quietly pull $500,000 in liquid cash out of my property's equity behind my back, he and his entitled daughter could run off with an absolute fortune, leaving me entirely responsible for a massive federal bank lien on my own home. I frantically pieced together the final signature page, needing to see exactly how they planned to execute this massive fraud without my physical presence or consent. When the last torn fragment slotted into place, I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. At the bottom of the document, resting neatly on the primary borrower line, was my signature. It was not a sloppy imitation or a generic scribble. It was a flawless, meticulous forgery. Every loop, every precise angle, and every distinct curve of my handwriting had been replicated with terrifying accuracy. I stared at the blue ink, my mind flashing back to the day Sydney had hijacked my master bedroom. Suddenly, her aggressive demand for that specific room made perfect, sinister sense. She did not want the room for the natural lighting. She wanted access to the files I kept in my bedside nightstand. She had likely spent hours digging through my old bank statements and discarded household receipts, practicing my signature over and over until she perfected the exact pressure of my handwriting. They were not just a nuisance anymore. They were orchestrating a highly illegal financial heist. In the United States, submitting a forged signature on a federal lending document across state or corporate lines constitutes severe federal mortgage fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft. The penalties for these crimes do not result in a gentle slap on the wrist or a simple fine. They carry mandatory federal prison sentences. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, staring at the taped-together documents. David thought he was a mastermind. He thought because he was legally my husband, he could blur the lines of marital assets and walk away a rich man. He fundamentally misunderstood the gravity of crossing federal banking regulators. As a senior luxury appraiser, my entire career was built on preventing exactly this type of property fraud. I worked directly with the fraud departments of major lending institutions to verify asset integrity. I knew their strict protocols, their automated triggers, and exactly how aggressively they prosecuted offenders. To finalize a HELOC of this magnitude, the bank would absolutely require a comprehensive in-person property appraisal to verify the collateral value of the estate. David could not just submit the paperwork and wait for a massive check to arrive in the mail. He would have to coordinate a physical inspection of my home without me knowing. That meant he was going to try to sneak a corrupt appraiser onto my property within the next few days, while he assumed I was out of the house working. I carefully placed the reconstructed loan application into a clear plastic evidence sleeve. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, absolute resolve. The squatter's strategy was pathetic. The pool party was a childish annoyance, but this forged document was the ultimate weapon. They had handed me the exact tool I needed to destroy them permanently. I locked the evidence sleeve inside my heavy floor safe, placing it right next to the external hard drive containing their incriminating audio recordings. I checked the time. It was nearly midnight. Tomorrow was Monday, and I needed to be at my law firm the second the doors opened. My attorney Mitchell was going to have an absolute field day with this evidence. I turned off my desk lamp, the darkness wrapping around me like a protective cloak. David and Sydney were sleeping upstairs in my master bedroom, dreaming of a $500,000 payday. They had absolutely no idea that they had just crossed a legal tripwire from which there was no return. The financial guillotine was primed, and I was going to be the one to drop the blade. At exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning, I walked through the heavy glass doors of Mitchell & Associates. I did not bother with an appointment. Mitchell was my private wealth attorney, a man whose retainer I paid handsomely precisely so I could bypass receptionists. He was a shark in a tailored suit specializing in high net worth asset protection, and he possessed the same clinical ruthlessness that I applied to my appraisals. I bypassed his secretary with a brief nod and stepped directly into his corner office. Mitchell looked up from his dual monitors, noting the intense focus radiating from my posture. I locked his door behind me, walked over to his massive conference table, and began unloading my briefcase. I laid everything out with methodical precision. First, the encrypted flash drive containing the high-definition video of Terrence deliberately smashing the $15,000 Ming vase. Second, the audio file capturing the midnight kitchen meeting where David and Sydney explicitly plotted their squatter strategy and discussed securing a medical proxy by manufacturing a fake mental breakdown. Finally, I placed the clear plastic evidence sleeve containing the taped-together home equity line of credit application in the center of the table. I tapped the bottom of the final page, pointing directly at the flawless forgery of my signature. Mitchell leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the reconstructed document. The room was perfectly silent for a long moment, as his legal mind processed the magnitude of what lay before him. He picked up his reading glasses, examining the exact strokes of the blue ink. Then he sat back, letting out a low, humorless laugh. "They actually put this in writing," Mitchell said, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Your husband and his daughter are attempting to extract $500,000 from your primary residence through a fraudulent federal banking document. Gwen, this is not just a messy domestic dispute. This is a Class B felony. Attempted federal mortgage fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The penalties for these combined offenses carry mandatory federal prison time." I crossed my arms, feeling a deep sense of vindication. "David thinks he can force me out by declaring me legally incompetent," I explained, referencing the audio recording. "He wants to call the police for a wellness check, claim I am having a psychotic break, and use that to gain power of attorney. He thinks my silence over the past few weeks is proof that I am cracking under the pressure." Mitchell smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that made me grateful he was on my side. "The medical proxy strategy is entirely dead on arrival," he stated confidently. "David fundamentally fails to understand the rigorous compliance standards of your profession. You are a senior luxury real estate appraiser holding a state-certified general license. To maintain that license, you undergo mandatory federal background checks, continuous professional scrutiny, and you literally passed a state-mandated psychological and ethical compliance evaluation just 3 days ago to renew your corporate vendor status." Mitchell stood up and began pacing the length of his office. "Your active professional credentials make you absolutely immune to their gaslighting tactics," he continued. "If David tries to claim you are mentally unstable, I will personally hand the responding officers your updated state certification and your corporate performance reviews from the past month." A judge would laugh him out of the courtroom before he even finished filing the petition. His entire narrative is a legally indefensible fantasy. We moved on to the most critical piece of the puzzle, the loan application. I explained my theory about the required property appraisal. David would need a corrupt appraiser to physically evaluate the house to finalize the underwriting process. Mitchell agreed immediately, noting that the bank listed on the application had incredibly strict compliance protocols for loans of this size. "Normally, I would call the bank right now and have this application immediately terminated," Mitchell said, picking up the plastic evidence sleeve. "We could shut this down today and file for an emergency restraining order." "No," I replied instantly, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. "If we shut it down now, they will just claim it was a misunderstanding. David will say he was getting quotes and never intended to file the final paperwork. Sydney will deny tracing my signature. They will play the victims and try to tie me up in family court for years, fighting over spousal support and property division. I do not want them inconvenienced. I want them ruined." Mitchell stopped pacing. He looked at me, a profound respect gleaming in his eyes. "What exactly do you have in mind?" "I want you to contact the bank internal fraud investigation department," I instructed, "but do not tell them to cancel the loan. Tell them to set a trap. I want the bank to let the application proceed to the final closing date. I want David and Sydney to believe they have won. Let them schedule the mobile notary. Let them sign the final federal documents in my kitchen. We catch them in the absolute final act of the crime, leaving them zero room for plausible deniability." Mitchell picked up his secure desk phone, dialing a direct unlisted number he possessed for the regional director of fraud prevention at the lending institution. I listened as he bypassed the standard customer service channels, utilizing his corporate connections to get an immediate audience with the senior investigators. He outlined the situation with brutal efficiency, explaining that the primary homeowner had discovered a forged application and was willing to cooperate fully in a sting operation to catch the perpetrators executing the fraudulent documents. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. When Mitchell finally hung up the phone, he turned to me with a look of absolute triumph. "The bank fraud department is entirely on board," he confirmed. "They are furious that someone attempted to compromise their lending integrity. They are going to approve the preliminary underwriting tomorrow morning. They will contact David to schedule the final closing signatures for this coming Friday." The trap was officially armed. My husband and his entitled daughter were currently sitting in my house, celebrating their imaginary victory, completely unaware that federal investigators were now coordinating their downfall. I thanked Mitchell, gathered my briefcase, and walked out of the law firm. The countdown to Friday had begun, and I was going to ensure their final week of freedom was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Tuesday evening arrived with a surprising shift in the household dynamic. When I returned from an inspection, the house was quiet. My clothes were still shoved in the guest room and the internet was throttled to a crawl, but David was waiting in the foyer. He wore his best tailored suit, holding a bouquet of white lilies, and wearing a smile so sickeningly sweet it almost turned my stomach. He stepped forward, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "Gwen, sweetheart," David said, his voice dripping with manufactured affection. "I know things have been tense lately with the kids staying here. I want to make it up to you. I made reservations at a nice restaurant for just the two of us. 8 o'clock. Go get dressed. We need a quiet evening to reconnect." I looked at the lilies, then up at his impeccably groomed face. The sudden pivot from hostile squatter to devoted husband was jarring, but I knew exactly what this was. Mitchell had warned me that David would need to establish a documented trail of my supposed mental decline before he could execute his medical proxy strategy. He needed me isolated, pliable, and out of the house. I accepted the flowers with a soft, compliant smile, matching his performance flawlessly. "That sounds lovely, David," I murmured. "Give me 30 minutes. Upstairs in the guest suite, I dressed in a classic navy sheath dress. Before leaving the room, I opened my purse and took out my smartphone. I navigated to the voice memo application, checked the battery life, and disabled the lock screen sleep function. I hit the red record button, verified the audio bars were picking up sound, and slipped the phone into the side pocket of my leather clutch, leaving the zipper slightly open for optimal acoustic clarity. I was walking into a gaslighting ambush, and I intended to capture every single word of federal evidence. The atmosphere at the restaurant was intimate and softly lit. David played the role of the perfect gentleman. He pulled out my chair, ordered a highly expensive bottle of Bordeaux, and kept his hand resting affectionately over mine on the white linen tablecloth. For the first 45 minutes, he avoided any mention of Sydney or Terrence. He asked about my day, complimented my appearance, and reminisced about our early dating years. It was a masterclass in manipulation designed to disarm my defenses and make me crave the marital stability I had supposedly been lacking. When the main courses were cleared and the waiter poured our coffee, David's demeanor shifted. He leaned across the table, his thumb gently stroking the back of my hand, his brow furrowed with deep theatrical concern. "Gwen, I brought you here tonight because I love you and because I am deeply worried about you." David began, his tone hushed and intimate. "You have not been yourself lately. You have been locking yourself in your office, ignoring the family. But it is more than just stress. I am seeing things that genuinely terrify me." I kept my expression perfectly neutral, letting my eyes widen slightly as if confused. "What do you mean, David? I have just been busy with work." He sighed heavily, shaking his head. "Sweetheart, you left the gas stove on high all night last Thursday. Sydney woke up to get a glass of water and found the kitchen filled with gas. We could have lost the house. We could have all died." I stared at him, letting a flicker of genuine shock register on my face. It was a complete fabrication. I had not cooked on that stove in 3 weeks. He was inventing life-threatening scenarios to build his case. "I never used the stove," I stammered deliberately, making my voice waver. "Are you sure it was me?" "Who else could it be, Gwen?" he replied softly, squeezing my hand tighter. "And it is not just the stove. You left the front door wide open twice last week. The neighbors called me yesterday. They said they saw you wandering around the driveway in the middle of the night talking to yourself. They are concerned, Gwen. I am concerned. You are losing track of time and reality." The sheer brazenness of his lies was breathtaking. He was systematically weaving a narrative of severe cognitive decline, planting the seeds of dementia or a psychotic break. I pulled my hand away from his, wrapping my arms around myself as if I were suddenly freezing. I let my breathing hitch, forcing a look of absolute terror into my eyes. I do not remember any of that, I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. David, what is happening to me? Am I getting sick? He leaned closer, his eyes practically gleaming with the thrill of his successful manipulation. I think you are suffering from extreme burnout leading to memory lapses. I think you need to see a neurologist. But until we get this figured out, I need to protect you. I need to make sure your business and your assets are not compromised while you recover. David reached into his tailored jacket pocket and withdrew a folded legal document. He smoothed it out on the table between our coffee cups. I looked down. It was a comprehensive medical proxy and durable power of attorney. This is just a precaution, David said, his voice as smooth as velvet. It just gives me the temporary authority to handle the bills and manage the property, while you take a leave of absence to seek psychiatric help. Just sign it, Gwen. Let me carry the burden for you. I will take care of everything. I looked at the document. In a different life, an exhausted woman might actually sign it. I reached out with a trembling hand. I cannot sign it right now, David, I whispered. Let me read it over tonight. I promise I will sign it in the morning. He nodded, smiling very brightly. He actually believed he had won. He thought he had successfully manipulated a seasoned professional into handing over the keys to her kingdom. I placed the document carefully into my clutch, right next to the phone that was actively recording his federal crimes. The rest of the dinner passed with David playing the attentive, concerned husband. I played the exhausted, confused wife perfectly. When we got home, I retreated to the guest suite, immediately transferring the new audio file to my secure servers and sending a copy to Mitchell. The next morning was Wednesday. According to the timeline Mitchell had established with the bank fraud investigators, today was the day the required physical appraisal for the $500,000 line of credit was scheduled to take place. David was practically vibrating with nervous energy when I walked into the kitchen for my morning coffee. He had dressed in a casual polo shirt and slacks, trying to look relaxed, but his eyes kept darting to the wall clock. "You are heading out to the office today?" David asked, his voice entirely too casual. "Yes," I replied, picking up my car keys and deliberately leaving my heavy work laptop sitting on the dining room table. "I have a massive commercial estate to evaluate on the north side of the city. I probably will not be back until after 6 this evening." David exhaled a breath he had clearly been holding. "Good. Take your time, Gwen. Do not rush. Remember what we talked about last night. You need to minimize your stress. I will handle things around here." I gave him a weak, agreeable smile and walked out the front door. I climbed into my car, backed out of the driveway, and drove exactly 3 blocks away before pulling into the parking lot of a neighborhood community center. I turned off the engine and pulled out my tablet to access the exterior camera feeds. Mitchell had confirmed the bank required the appraisal by noon to process the Friday closing. David was attempting to bypass the bank's random appraiser assignment by bribing a private, corrupt contact to rubber stamp the inflated property valuation and ignore the fact that the primary homeowner was completely absent. I sat in my car and watched the clock. At 11:45, a gray sedan pulled into my driveway. A man in a cheap suit stepped out holding a digital laser measure and a clipboard. He looked around nervously before walking up to my front porch. David opened the door before the man even had a chance to ring the bell. The audio feed caught David greeting him enthusiastically, quickly ushering him inside and visibly handing him a thick white envelope. The bribe had been delivered. It was time to execute the countermaneuver. I started my engine, drove the 3 blocks back to my house, and pulled my vehicle directly into the driveway, horizontally blocking the gray sedan from leaving. I stepped out of my car, retrieved my professional credentials from the glove box, and walked up the front steps. I did not bother knocking. I used my key and pushed the heavy front door wide open. David and the appraiser were standing in the grand foyer. David was pointing toward the vaulted ceiling, gesturing to the custom chandelier, while the man scribbled blindly on his clipboard without even taking proper measurements. When the heavy door clicked shut behind me, David spun around. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. "Gwen," he choked out, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here? You said you were on the north side of the city." "I forgot my laptop," I said smoothly, walking into the foyer with slow, deliberate steps. I looked at the stranger holding the laser measure. "And who is this?" David stepped between us, his hands waving frantically. "This is just an insurance adjuster, Gwen. I told you I was handling the household administration. The insurance company just needed a routine square footage update. Go grab your laptop and head back to work. I have everything under control." I did not even look at David. I completely ignored him, focusing my entire predatory attention on the sweating man with the clipboard. I walked right past my husband and stopped 12 inches away from the stranger. "An insurance adjuster?" I asked softly. "That is fascinating. Because your clipboard clearly displays a uniform residential appraisal report, and the white envelope bulging in your inner breast pocket looks suspiciously like an off-the-books cash incentive." The man took a nervous step back, his eyes darting toward the front door. "Listen, lady, I am just here to do a job for the bank." I reached into my tailored jacket and pulled out my heavy state-issued badge. I flipped it open, displaying my gold medallion and my official license number. "My name is Gwen," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, authoritative cadence. "I am a state-certified general real estate appraiser and a senior auditor for commercial and luxury residential properties. I am also the sole legal owner of this estate. I am intimately familiar with the uniform standards of professional appraisal practice." The fake appraiser stared at my badge, his mouth hanging slightly open. He instantly realized he was not dealing with a clueless housewife. He was dealing with an apex predator in his own industry. I took another step forward, backing him against the mahogany console table. "Let me explain exactly what is happening right now." I continued, speaking with lethal clarity. The man standing behind me forged my signature on a federal home equity line of credit application for $500,000. He brought you here to conduct a fraudulent rubber-stamped valuation to push that federal loan through underwriting without the primary homeowner's consent. If you write down a single square foot on that clipboard, if you submit a single photograph of my property to that lending institution, you are actively participating in federal mortgage fraud and conspiracy to commit identity theft. The man began to physically shake. He dropped his laser measure. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. "I am not going to call the police," I whispered, leaning in closer. "I am going to call the State Board of Real Estate Appraisers. I am going to give them your license number. I will personally ensure your certification is permanently revoked by the end of the business day. And then I will hand your name over to the federal banking investigators who are currently monitoring this fraudulent loan application." David tried to intervene, grabbing my arm. "Gwen, stop it. You are having an episode. You are confused." I shook his hand off violently, never breaking eye contact with the terrified appraiser. "You have exactly 10 seconds to get off my property before I lock the doors and call the authorities to report a trespassing accomplice to federal wire fraud." 10, 9. The man did not even wait for 8. He threw the clipboard onto the floor, shoved past David, and sprinted for the front door. He scrambled down the porch steps, nearly tripping over his own feet. When he realized my car was blocking his exit in the driveway, he did not even ask me to move it. He drove his gray sedan straight over my manicured front lawn, tearing up the grass in a desperate, panicked frenzy to escape the federal trap he had just walked into. I stood in the foyer listening to the screech of his tires fading down the street. I slowly turned to face David. He was plastered against the wall, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with absolute terror. The confident gaslighting manipulator from the restaurant last night was completely gone. He was isolated, exposed, and his entire scheme was rapidly falling apart. "Well, David," I said, picking up the discarded clipboard from the floor and inspecting the blank form, "it looks like your insurance update will have to wait." I stepped around him, grabbed my laptop from the dining room table, and walked back out the front door, leaving him standing alone in the ruins of his collapsing heist. Friday was only 2 days away, and the final guillotine was almost ready to drop. Friday morning arrived with an electric current of anticipation humming through the walls of my estate. The previous 48 hours had been a masterclass in psychological endurance. After I chased his corrupt appraiser off the lawn, David had spent 2 days frantically backpedaling. He claimed he canceled the insurance update and begged me to forgive his overstepping. He laid the gaslighting on thick, acting like a deeply concerned husband, trying to manage a stressful household while dealing with my supposed mental fragility. I played along perfectly. I retreated to the guest suite, remained quiet, and let him believe he had successfully stabilized the situation. He needed to believe the path was clear for his grand finale. When I walked into the kitchen at 7 o'clock that morning, the atmosphere was thick with suppressed euphoria. David, Sydney, and Terrence were gathered around the marble island, drinking coffee and whispering in animated, hushed tones. They looked like bank robbers who had just dug the tunnel into the vault and were only waiting for the final green light. Sydney was practically vibrating with excitement, scrolling through luxury real estate listings on her phone, clearly shopping for the condo they planned to buy with my stolen equity. Terrence wore a smug, self-satisfied grin, acting as if he were the mastermind behind a brilliant corporate merger. David was pacing near the espresso machine, checking his watch every few minutes. They were buzzing with the intoxicating thrill of unearned wealth. They genuinely believed they were mere hours away from a $500,000 payday. I walked past them to pour my own coffee. The conversation immediately halted, replaced by tense, artificial smiles. "Good morning, Gwen," David said, his voice laced with an overly cheerful, jittery energy. He pulled out a bar stool for me, playing the role of the attentive partner. "You look incredibly sharp today. Big day at the office." I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting my eyes sweep over the three of them. I was wearing my favorite charcoal gray suit, a tailored, immaculate piece of armor. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless twist. I looked exactly like a woman preparing to execute a high-level corporate transaction. "Yes," I replied, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of suspicion. "It is going to be a massive day. I have a backlog of complex commercial property evaluations across the county. The schedule is completely packed from morning until night." David could not hide the profound relief washing over his features. He stepped closer, wrapping his arm around my waist in a display of sickening performative affection. "That sounds exhausting, sweetheart," he murmured, rubbing my shoulder. "You have been working so hard lately. You really need to pace yourself. What time do you think you will be finished? We could order some nice takeout for dinner when you get back." I looked him directly in the eyes. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was staring right back at me, hidden behind a mask of marital concern. "I will not be home until at least 8 o'clock tonight," I said with absolute certainty. "The final site inspection is all the way out in the western suburbs. You three go ahead and enjoy your evening. Do not wait up for me." "Excellent." David breathed out quickly, masking his triumphant reaction with a polite nod. "Take all the time you need, Gwen. We will hold down the fort here." I leaned in and pressed a brief, sterile kiss against his cheek. It was the ultimate act of deception, a mirror image of the betrayal he was attempting to inflict upon me. "Have a productive Friday." "David," I whispered. I turned and walked toward the foyer, my heels clicking against the hardwood in a steady, rhythmic cadence. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, silently cheering for my departure. They thought the obstacle was finally out of the way. They thought the house was theirs to command. I stepped out the front door, walked down the manicured pathway, and climbed into my luxury sedan. I started the engine, backed out of the driveway, and drove smoothly down the tree-lined street. I did not speed. I did not look back. I maintained the perfect illusion of a busy professional starting her workday. But I did not merge onto the highway. Instead, I navigated through the winding suburban roads, took 3 precise right turns, and circled back toward my own neighborhood. I found the perfect blind spot 2 streets over. It was a shaded parking alcove behind a thick row of towering evergreen trees, situated on a slight incline that offered a direct, unobstructed line of sight to the main intersection leading to my private drive. From this vantage point, anyone entering or leaving my property had to pass directly through my field of vision. I shifted my car into park, turned off the engine, and cracked the windows to let in the cool morning air. My vehicle instantly transformed into a mobile surveillance command center. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my encrypted iPad. I booted up the security network dashboard and connected to the high-definition cameras hidden inside my home. The split-screen interface loaded flawlessly. The live feed confirmed exactly what I expected. The moment my car had pulled out of the driveway, the facade inside the house completely evaporated. On camera 1, I watched Sydney jumping up and down in the kitchen, literally squealing with delight. She hugged Terrence, kissing him excitedly as he pumped his fist in the air. On camera 2, David was rushing through the living room, frantically clearing away the magazines and coffee cups, creating a large, pristine workspace on the dining room table. He was setting the stage for the fraudulent closing. My cell phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a secure text message from my attorney, Mitchell. "The Bank Fraud Division is on standby," the message read. "The regional investigator has confirmed the mobile notary is scheduled to arrive at your address at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon. The snare is live. We are ready when you are." I typed back a single word: acknowledged. I placed the phone down and settled back into my leather seat. The waiting game had officially commenced. For the next several hours, I sat in the quiet shadows of the evergreen trees, my eyes locked on the digital feeds. I watched the perpetrators pacing my floors, pouring celebratory drinks, and eagerly checking the windows for the arrival of their golden ticket. The tension in the air was palpable, a heavy, suffocating calm before an absolute hurricane. They believed they were waiting for the final piece of their brilliant financial heist. They did not realize they were simply waiting for the executioner to drop the blade. The digital clock on my dashboard flipped to 1:55 in the afternoon. The quiet suburban street remained perfectly still, bathing in the warm afternoon sunlight. Inside the cabin of my sedan, the air felt charged with a quiet, lethal electricity. I kept my eyes locked on the split-screen display of my tablet, watching my husband pace the length of our hardwood foyer. David was checking his phone every 30 seconds, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. In the kitchen, Sydney and Terrence were leaning against the marble island, reviewing a stack of practice papers. Sydney was holding a blue ink pen, tracing loops and curves over and over again, warming up her hand for the performance of a lifetime. At precisely 1:58, a black sedan turned the corner and slowly rolled down my street. I sank lower into my leather seat, ensuring I remained completely concealed behind the thick evergreen branches. The vehicle pulled into my driveway, parking haphazardly behind David's leased luxury car. A man stepped out. He did not look like a standard banking official. He wore a rumpled gray suit that fit poorly across the shoulders and carried a battered leather briefcase. He had the nervous, shifting energy of a person accustomed to operating in the gray areas of the law. This was the mobile notary, the final crucial pawn in their fraudulent scheme. David opened the front door before the man even reached the porch steps. The audio feed from the foyer camera picked up the frantic squeak of the hinges. David ushered the notary inside, pulling him out of the daylight and quickly slamming the heavy wooden door shut. I switched my primary viewing screen to camera 4, the high-definition lens hidden in the molding above the kitchen island. David led the notary directly into the kitchen. Terrence stood up straight, puffing out his chest to project an air of corporate authority, while Sydney quickly hid her practice papers beneath a magazine. The notary placed his battered briefcase on the marble countertop. He popped the brass latches and withdrew a massive stack of legal documents. Even through the surveillance feed, I could easily recognize the standard blue binding of a federal closing packet. It was the finalized paperwork for the $500,000 home equity line of credit. "Let us get this done quickly," David said, his voice tight and breathless. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket. "We appreciate your discretion today. We understand you are taking a professional risk bypassing the standard identification protocols." The notary offered a sleazy, conspiratorial smile. He did not ask to see a driver license. He did not ask to verify the primary borrower. Instead, he simply extended his empty hand across the marble island. "Discretion is an expensive service," he replied smoothly. "But as long as the compensation matches the risk I am legally blind to, whoever holds the pen. David pulled out a thick, unmarked white envelope and handed it directly to the notary. The man opened the flap, running his thumb over a thick stack of $100 bills. He nodded, satisfied with the bribe, and slipped the envelope into his inner suit pocket. He then turned the heavy stack of banking documents around, pushing them across the island toward Sydney. He tapped a manicured finger against the primary signature line. "Sign everywhere there is a yellow sticky tab," the notary instructed, leaning back and looking entirely away from the table. "I just need to verify that a signature was placed on the required lines." This was the moment of absolute, undeniable criminality. My heart beat with a slow, powerful rhythm. I hit the screen record button on my application, ensuring that the software captured the live footage directly to my secure cloud server. The video quality was impeccable. Sydney stepped up to the documents. She did not hesitate. She picked up the blue ink pen, took a deep breath, and leaned over the marble island. I watched in chilling high definition as my 24-year-old stepdaughter began executing a federal crime. She moved the pen with practiced fluid precision, replicating my exact signature onto the first page of the closing packet. She flipped the page and signed the second one. Terrence stood directly behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders, offering physical encouragement as she committed identity theft. David hovered on her right side, his eyes darting frantically toward the kitchen windows, terrified that a neighbor might look inside. They were functioning as a unified criminal enterprise. Every single one of them was actively participating in the fraud. The notary accepted the cash to look the other way. David orchestrated the loan. Terrence provided the moral support. Sydney executed the forgery. She signed page after page: the mortgage agreement, the truth in lending disclosure, the automated clearinghouse transfer authorization. With every stroke of her pen, she was attempting to extract $500,000 of my hard-earned equity and transfer it directly into a dummy account David had established. The sheer arrogance of their actions was staggering. They felt completely invincible inside my home. I zoomed in on the camera feed, capturing a perfect close-up of Sydney's hand moving across the final signature line. The blue ink flowed over the paper, sealing their fate. The notary stepped forward, picked up his official brass stamp, and began pressing his seal onto the forged pages, officially notarizing a fraudulent federal document. The crime was entirely complete. The evidence was irrefutable. They had crossed the point of no return, and there was absolutely zero room for legal interpretation or defensive gaslighting. I picked up my smartphone from the passenger seat. I opened my messaging application and selected the secure chat thread with Mitchell. My thumbs moved rapidly across the digital keyboard, typing out the final command of my entire surveillance operation. "They are signing. Move in now. Done." I watched the delivery confirmation appear beneath my text message. I shifted my vehicle into drive and pulled out from the shadowy alcove behind the towering evergreens. My tires gripped the asphalt as I navigated the short distance back to my own property. It took exactly 45 seconds to reach the front of my house. I pulled my luxury sedan directly into the driveway, positioning it horizontally behind the notary's battered vehicle, effectively trapping his car on the concrete. There would be no frantic escape this time. As I put my car into park, an unmarked black sport utility vehicle pulled up to the curb directly in front of my mailbox. Mitchell stepped out of the passenger side, looking perfectly composed, in a sharp, dark navy suit. The rear doors opened in unison, and two broad-shouldered men stepped onto the sidewalk. They wore plainclothes business attire, but their rigid posture, observant eyes, and the distinct outline of holstered weapons beneath their jackets immediately broadcasted their true profession. These were elite financial fraud detectives from the Federal Task Force. Mitchell had not exaggerated his high-level connections. I stepped out of my car and met them at the bottom of the porch steps. Mitchell offered a curt, professional nod. I did not speak. I simply walked up the brick stairs, inserted my key into the heavy brass lock, and turned the deadbolt. I pushed the heavy oak front door open with enough force that it banged loudly against the interior wall stopper. The sudden violent noise echoed through the vaulted foyer like a gunshot. I strode into my own home with absolute terrifying composure. Mitchell walked smoothly on my right while the two financial fraud detectives flanked me on my left, creating an impenetrable wall of legal authority. Our synchronized footsteps hit the hardwood floor, echoing ominously as we marched straight toward the open archway of the kitchen. The scene inside the kitchen froze in an instant tableau of absolute panic. The smug atmosphere of impending wealth shattered the moment my face appeared in the archway. David was holding a silver pen, clearly preparing to countersign the final borrower authorization page. When he saw me standing there flanked by unfamiliar men in suits, his fingers went completely slack. The silver pen slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against the marble island before rolling off the edge and hitting the floor. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked as though he might physically collapse. Sydney spun around from the counter, her eyes wide with shock. The blue ink pen she had just used to commit federal identity theft was still tightly clutched in her right hand. For a split second, her brain failed to process the reality of my arrival. Then her arrogant entitlement flared up a desperate defense mechanism against the sudden intrusion. "What are you doing here?" Sydney screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the custom cabinetry. "Get out! We are having a private meeting. You are supposed to be at work until 8 o'clock. David finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. Pure, unadulterated terror flooded his eyes. He frantically threw his arms over the massive stack of blue-bound closing documents, trying to physically cover the federal paperwork with his own body. He grabbed a glossy lifestyle magazine from the corner of the island and threw it over the signature pages, completely failing to hide the obvious bulk of the loan application. "Gwen, sweetheart?" David stammered, his voice cracking and pitching upward in sheer panic. "We are just going over some updated insurance policies for the estate. It is boring administrative stuff. You do not need to worry about this. Go back to work. Please just go back to your evaluations. I will handle all the paperwork here." I did not break my stride. I did not raise my voice, nor did I acknowledge Sydney's hysterical shrieking. I walked straight past my trembling husband and approached the marble island. Terrence tried to step forward to block my path, attempting to puff out his chest and project authority. One of the plainclothes detectives simply looked at him, placing a firm hand on his own suit jacket near his hip. Terrence instantly recognized the implicit threat, swallowed hard, and backed away, completely abandoning his tough guy persona. I reached the island and smoothly swept the glossy magazine off the stack of documents. I placed my right hand firmly down on the paperwork, pinning the fraudulent home equity line of credit application directly against the cold marble countertop. I did not look at David. I did not look at Sydney. I locked my eyes entirely on the sweating, rumpled notary standing on the other side of the island. The man was visibly shaking his eyes, darting frantically toward the front door, realizing he was completely trapped. The thick envelope of bribe money bulging in his pocket suddenly looked like an anchor that was about to drag him straight to prison. "You just witnessed a forged signature on a federal bank document," I stated, my voice dropping to a freezing absolute cadence that commanded the entire room. "I am the sole legal owner of this property. I am the only individual authorized to encumber this estate, and I have never signed a single page of this application." The notary opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He took a stumbling step backward, wiping perspiration from his brow. David grabbed my forearm, his fingers digging into my suit jacket. "Gwen, you are confused," he hissed, trying desperately to revive his medical proxy gaslighting strategy. "You signed these papers yesterday morning. You told me to handle the final notarization. Your memory is failing you again. Gentlemen, please. My wife is suffering from severe cognitive issues. She is having a mental breakdown right now." Mitchell stepped forward, forcefully removing David's hand from my arm. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp, certified folder. He placed it directly on top of the forged loan documents. "Do not even attempt that narrative," David Mitchell said, his voice laced with professional disgust. "My client is a certified senior appraiser in impeccable standing. We have her active licensing records right here, along with a state-mandated psychological evaluation she passed flawlessly 3 days ago. She is entirely competent, and she is the only victim in this room." The two plainclothes detectives stepped forward simultaneously. They reached into their suit jackets and pulled out their gold badges, letting them hang clearly visible from their lanyards. Federal Financial Fraud Task Force. The lead detective announced, his voice booming with undeniable authority. Nobody moves. Nobody touches those documents. This is now an active federal crime scene. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The luxurious ambiance of my custom kitchen was instantly transformed into the harsh reality of an interrogation room. Sydney dropped the blue ink pen. It hit the marble counter with a sharp crack, the sound marking the exact moment her entire reality shattered into pieces. Terrence backed away until his shoulders hit the stainless steel refrigerator, his arrogant smirk replaced by sheer, unfiltered terror. David let out a low, strangled gasp, finally understanding that his grand financial heist had been a meticulously orchestrated trap, and the steel jaws had just snapped completely shut around his neck. The absolute shock paralyzing the kitchen lasted only a few seconds before Sydney triggered her survival instincts. Like any predator stripped of its primary advantage, she immediately pivoted to her secondary attack strategy. The arrogant girl who had just traced my signature with absolute confidence suddenly vanished. In her place, a masterclass in theatrical victimhood emerged. Sydney threw her hands over her face, letting out a piercing sob that echoed off the countertops. She practically threw herself toward the lead detective, her face twisted into an expression of manufactured panic. "You have to understand, she is completely crazy," Sydney shrieked, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "She has early onset dementia. She is losing her grip on reality. She signed those exact papers yesterday morning, and now she has entirely forgotten she even did it. She is sick. My dad has the medical proxy to prove she is losing her mind. We are just trying to protect her estate before she destroys everything we have." Terrence immediately recognized the life raft his wife was throwing them and jumped on board. He stepped away from the refrigerator, nodding vigorously at the federal agents. "It is the absolute truth," Officer Terrence insisted. "Gwen has been wandering the house late at night. She leaves the gas stove on high while everyone is sleeping. She is a profound danger to herself. We only moved in because David was terrified she might burn the place down. This whole display today is just another one of her paranoid delusions. She needs immediate psychiatric help, not a police intervention." David caught the lifeline as well. He straightened his posture, wiping the sweat from his face, trying to mold himself back into the noble patriarch he always pretended to be. "I have the proxy documentation right here in my briefcase," David pleaded. "I can show you the paperwork right now. I am her legal husband. I am just trying to manage the complicated household finances while we transition her into a safe care facility." I stood perfectly still, watching the three of them spin their desperate web of lies. They expected the detectives to view me as a confused, erratic spouse. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not scream that they were lying. I simply maintained eye contact with the lead detective, allowing my silence to contrast sharply against their chaotic performance. The lead detective did not flinch. He did not offer David a sympathetic nod, nor did he attempt to comfort Sydney. He simply looked at the heavy stack of blue-bound loan documents pinned beneath my hand, and then looked over at my attorney. Mitchell stepped forward, commanding the room with the effortless authority of a man who destroys fragile lies for a living. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, crisp folder sealed with a bright gold state emblem. He bypassed my husband entirely and handed the certified folder directly to the lead detective. "Do not even attempt to insult our intelligence with that pathetic narrative," Mitchell said, his voice laced with professional disgust. "It is insulting to the law and insulting to my client." Mitchell gestured toward me, his posture rigid. "My client is a senior luxury real estate appraiser in perfect professional standing. To maintain her state-certified general license, she undergoes continuous, rigorous scrutiny. More importantly, because her professional portfolio requires federal compliance, she passed a mandatory comprehensive state psychological and background evaluation literally 3 days ago." The words landed like heavy stones in the center of the kitchen. Sydney stopped fake crying. Her dramatic sobs choked off in her throat as she stared at the gold seal on the folder the detective was reviewing. Mitchell leaned over the marble island, looking directly into David's terrified eyes. "Your entire mental instability narrative is officially dead, David. You cannot declare a woman legally incompetent when she holds active, flawless state certifications proving her cognitive health. Your medical proxy is a worthless piece of paper obtained through deliberate domestic gaslighting. You were attempting to build a fabricated medical history to steal her estate. The lead detective closed the certified folder, handing it to his partner before turning his attention back to David. Sir, claiming your wife is mentally unfit to cover up the execution of a fraudulent federal loan document only adds to the severity of the charges you are facing. You are standing in a room with federal financial fraud investigators. We operate on hard evidence. Terrence swallowed hard. The commanding, arrogant facade he had maintained for the past 3 weeks evaporated entirely. He looked at the door, clearly calculating whether he could make a run for it. But the second detective had already shifted his stance, physically blocking the archway. There was absolutely no escape. Sydney began to hyperventilate, realizing that her performance had further incriminated them in front of federal authorities. She looked at her father, her eyes wide with accusation. "You said this would work," she hissed at David, completely breaking character. "You said she was weak enough that nobody would question us." David squeezed his eyes shut. The room was heavy with the crushing weight of their downfall. They had tried to weaponize my mental health, an archaic, cowardly tactic designed to strip a woman of her agency and her assets. They believed they could isolate me, confuse me, and steal everything I had built. They failed to realize that I had fortified my life with impenetrable professional walls. Every move they made to declare me insane only highlighted their own desperate criminal intent. I lifted my hand off the forged loan application, stepping back to let the detectives secure the physical evidence. The time for talking and maneuvering was completely over. The snare had tightened and the final layer of their destruction was about to be laid out bare for the authorities. I stood silent, watching them realize their entire lives were finally permanently ruined. The profound silence hanging over the kitchen was absolute. The lead detective signaled for his partner to secure the physical documents in an evidence bag. David stared at the marble floor, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. He was desperately searching his mind for one last excuse, one final lie to twist the narrative back in his favor. I did not give him the chance to formulate a single word. I calmly reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved my encrypted tablet. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I maintained the exact same clinical detachment I used during a high-level corporate boardroom presentation. I unlocked the screen, bypassed the security firewall, and turned the display around so the two federal detectives had a perfect, unobstructed view. "Let me eliminate any remaining confusion regarding who exactly signed those documents," I stated evenly. I tapped the screen and pressed play. The high-definition video from camera 4 flooded the tablet display. The 4K resolution was flawless, capturing the precise lighting of the kitchen from just 5 minutes prior. The detectives leaned in, their eyes locked on the footage. The video clearly showed the mobile notary placing the blue-bound closing packet on the marble island. It showed David handing over the thick white envelope of bribe money. Most damning of all, the camera zoomed in perfectly on Sydney. The footage captured her gripping the blue ink pen and physically tracing my signature onto the federal bank forms, while Terrence stood right behind her, offering his silent support. The lead detective pulled a small notepad from his inner jacket pocket and began writing. "That is incredibly clear footage, Mum," he noted, his voice dropping an octave as he glared at Sydney. "We have the physical act of forgery completely documented with a verified timestamp." Sydney let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. She backed away from the island, her hands flying to her mouth. The reality of the surveillance footage destroyed any hope she had of claiming ignorance or blaming someone else. The notary, seeing his own face accepting the cash bribe in glorious high definition, actually groaned out loud and slumped heavily against the stainless steel refrigerator. "But we are not finished," I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy air. Claiming I am mentally unstable was not a desperate spur-of-the-moment defense strategy. It was a calculated, premeditated conspiracy to steal my net worth from the very beginning. I swiped across the tablet screen, opening the secure audio file I had extracted from their 2 a.m. kitchen meeting weeks ago. I maximized the volume on the device and pressed play. The pristine, enhanced audio filled the room. Sydney's voice echoed clearly off the custom cabinetry. "The lawyer said 30 days. If we stay past 30 days, we get squatters' rights. We establish permanent residency. Once we hit that mark, she cannot legally evict us without a court order. Terrence's recorded voice followed immediately, low and calculating. You just need to keep your focus, Sydney. Do not let her get under your skin. We stick to the timeline. Then came the absolute final nail in the coffin. David's voice broadcasted loudly from the tablet, exposing his ultimate betrayal to the federal agents standing right in front of him. If I can prove she is mentally unstable, if I can document that she is a danger to herself or losing her grip on reality, I can file for a medical proxy. I can get power of attorney over the entire estate. I am her legal husband. If she is declared unfit, I gain total control of her assets, her bank accounts, and this house. We keep applying pressure. We make her look unhinged. I paused the playback and set the tablet down firmly on the marble island. I looked directly at David. David physically broke. His knees buckled beneath him, giving way under the crushing, undeniable weight of his own recorded words. He collapsed onto the bar stool, gripping the edge of the marble counter just to keep his balance. His face turned an ashen, sickly gray. He slowly tilted his head backward, staring at the security cameras hidden perfectly inside the crown molding above the cabinets, finally realizing what he had completely overlooked. His entire scheme had not just failed at the finish line. It had been meticulously monitored, recorded, and cataloged since the very first day they invaded my home. Every stolen snack, every whispered plot, every arrogant insult had been collected as federal evidence. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a vulnerable target, but I had owned the board the entire time. You recorded us, David whispered, his voice completely hollow, stripped of all its former authority. You watched us every single day. I protected my assets, David, I replied coldly. You tried to build a kingdom on my back. I simply let you dig your own grave. Mitchell stepped forward seamlessly, taking command of the room. He snapped his leather briefcase shut, the sharp click cutting through the heavy silence. He looked at my husband with the absolute disdain of a predator observing cornered prey. Do not confuse the jurisdiction of your actions, David Mitchell stated, his voice ringing with absolute legal authority. You are accustomed to manipulating family court and using domestic disputes to hide your financial incompetence. But you stepped entirely out of your league the moment you decided to defraud a major national bank. This is not a family dispute, David, it is a federal crime. Mitchell began ticking off the charges on his fingers, each one landing like a physical blow. You are looking at aggravated identity theft for replicating my client's signature. You are facing wire fraud for utilizing electronic banking systems to facilitate this transaction. And your crown jewel is attempted federal mortgage fraud. When you combine those offenses, the federal sentencing guidelines do not offer probation. They offer mandatory prison time. You are looking at a minimum of 15 to 20 years behind bars for this little stunt. The lead detective nodded in agreement. He unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic rattling sound was the loudest noise in the kitchen. It was the sound of complete and utter ruin. He gestured to his partner, who immediately moved toward the trembling notary. The notary put his hands up, taking a frantic step backward until his back hit the stainless steel oven. I did not know, the man stammered, his voice pitching upward in pure terror. I was just hired for a mobile signing. I am an independent contractor. I thought she was the homeowner. I swear I had no idea this was a scam. The second detective grabbed the man's arm, twisting him around with practiced efficiency. He slammed the notary against the appliance and snapped the steel cuffs around his wrists. Save it for the federal prosecutor, the detective ordered. We have high-definition video of you accepting a cash bribe to bypass identification protocols. You are an active participant in a criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The notary slumped forward, openly weeping, as the detective finished reciting the Miranda warning. He was swiftly escorted out the front door, removed from the chessboard entirely. The lead detective turned his attention back to the kitchen island. He looked directly at David and Sydney. Put your hands on the marble counter, he commanded, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. Do it right now. David completely unraveled. The facade of the protective father, the man who had spent the last month catering to his daughter's every entitled whim, vanished in an instant. When faced with the terrifying reality of a federal prison sentence, David's self-preservation instinct obliterated his parental loyalty. He threw his hands into the air and practically shoved Sydney toward the detective. It was her idea. David screamed, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic cowardice. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his 24-year-old daughter. I did not forge the signature. You saw the video. She is the one who traced Gwen's handwriting. She is the one who practiced it for weeks. She found the blank application online and printed it out. I just wanted a small loan to help her get an apartment. She manipulated me into doing this. Sydney gasped, her mouth falling open in sheer horror. She stared at her father, completely unable to process the magnitude of his betrayal. The man who had enabled her worst behavior, who had encouraged her to seize my master bedroom and treat me like a servant, was now offering her up to federal authorities to save his own skin. Dad, how could you say that? Sydney cried out, tears of genuine panic streaming down her face. You told me this would work. You said you talked to a lawyer. You said we would get $500,000 and never have to worry about rent again. You promised me we would get this house. David shook his head frantically, backing away from her. Do not listen to her, he pleaded with the detectives. She is a liar. She set this whole thing up. I am just a victim of her manipulation. Sydney let out a hysterical, breathless sob. She spun around, desperately searching for a lifeline. She reached out and grabbed her husband's arm, her fingernails digging into his expensive, tailored shirt. Terrence, do something, she begged, her voice rising to a frantic shriek. Tell them it was my dad's plan. Call your firm. Call one of your corporate lawyers. You have to stop them from taking me. Terrence looked at his wife, then looked at the federal agents. His arrogant, superior demeanor had been completely crushed. He reached down and physically peeled Sydney's hands off his shirt, pushing her away with a look of absolute disgust. I am not calling anyone for you, Terrence said, his voice shaking with fear. I did not sign a single page of those documents. I did not forge anything. I am completely innocent here. Keep me out of your mess, Sydney. I am not going to federal prison because your stupid family could not pull off a basic scam. Sydney stood completely isolated in the center of the kitchen. Her father had betrayed her. Her husband had abandoned her. The impenetrable shield of her entitlement had been entirely shattered by the brutal reality of the law. She collapsed onto her knees, sobbing wildly into her hands. The lead detective stepped forward, completely unmoved by the dramatic performance. He grabbed David by the shoulders, spinning him around and pressing his chest firmly against the marble island. David let out a pathetic whimper as the cold steel handcuffs locked securely around his wrists. David, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal mortgage fraud, identity theft, and wire fraud, the detective stated clearly, his voice echoing off the custom cabinetry. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. The second detective returned to the kitchen, walking straight up to Sydney. He grabbed her by the upper arms, hauling her off the floor. She screamed and thrashed, kicking her feet against the cabinets, but the agent easily overpowered her. He pinned her arms behind her back, locking the cuffs securely in place. She continued to wail, her cries of protest bouncing uselessly against the walls. Sydney, you are under arrest for aggravated identity theft and federal mortgage fraud, the detective recited calmly, ignoring her hysterical sobbing. I stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold from the edge of the kitchen. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I watched my husband and his daughter being read their Miranda rights right in the middle of the luxury kitchen they had tried to steal from me. They had invaded my sanctuary, disrespected my property, and attempted to rob me of my hard-earned wealth. I watched David twist his head around, trying to catch my eye one last time. He looked like a drowning man begging for a life preserver. I did not offer him a single shred of comfort. I simply stared back with eyes as hard and unyielding as the marble countertop he was pinned against. Please, Gwen. David choked out, tears spilling over his eyelashes and dripping onto the stone. You can stop this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. We are legally married. You can save me. I stepped closer, my heels tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm on the floor. I leaned in just close enough for him to hear me over Sydney's continued wailing. I am a senior luxury real estate appraiser, David, I whispered softly. I evaluate assets for a living. And I have evaluated you. You are completely worthless. I turned my back on him and nodded to the detectives. Take them away. The heavy footsteps of the federal detectives echoed down the hallway as they marched my husband and his hysterical daughter out the front door. Sydney was still screaming, her voice growing faint as she was shoved into the back of an unmarked federal vehicle. David remained completely silent. His head hung low in absolute defeat. I stood in the center of the kitchen feeling a profound sense of clarity. The toxic infection that had plagued my home was finally being excised. But there was still one parasite left in the room. Terrence let out a loud, heavy breath. He ran his hands over his face and aggressively smoothed down the front of his expensive tailored shirt. With David and Sydney gone, his survival instincts kicked in, and he immediately attempted to resurrect his arrogant, untouchable finance bro persona. He looked around the kitchen, grabbed his designer jacket off the back of a bar stool, and let out a short, dismissive scoff. Well, that was a massive disaster, Terrence muttered, shaking his head as if he had merely witnessed a bad movie rather than the federal arrest of his wife and father-in-law. He looked at me with a sickeningly smug grin. Good luck sorting out this mess, Gwen. But I did not sign a single page of those documents. I did not forge anything, and I did not handle the bribe money. You cannot touch me. I am leaving. He threw his jacket over his shoulder and took a confident step toward the foyer, fully believing he had outsmarted the federal trap. He honestly thought he could just walk out the front door, return to his luxury apartment, and continue living his arrogant life completely unscathed. I stepped smoothly sideways, planting my heels directly in the center of the archway. I completely blocked his exit. You did not commit mortgage fraud, Terrence, I said, my voice dropping to a freezing absolute pitch. But you did commit vandalism. Terrence stopped in his tracks, rolling his eyes in exaggerated annoyance. Are you seriously bringing up that stupid broken pot right now? I told you it was the wind. You cannot prove anything. Move out of my way before I call the police for false imprisonment. I did not move a single inch. I offered a slight nod to my left. Mitchell stepped forward, withdrawing a massive, tightly bound stack of legal documents from his briefcase. With a sharp, aggressive motion, Mitchell shoved the thick packet directly against Terrence's chest. Terrence instinctively brought his hands up to catch the heavy paperwork before it hit the floor. You have just been officially served, Terrence Mitchell announced, his voice ringing with absolute legal authority. This is a comprehensive civil lawsuit filed against you for the intentional destruction of private property, specifically a 16th-century Ming Dynasty vase valued at exactly $15,000. Terrence looked down at the paperwork, a condescending smirk still fighting to remain on his face. A civil suit for a vase. You are pathetic, Gwen. It was an accident. I will get my corporate lawyers to have this thrown out by Monday morning. I took a slow, measured step toward him, completely invading his personal space. You really do not pay attention, Terrence, I whispered, staring dead into his arrogant eyes. You did not trip. You did not stumble. I have pristine 4K security footage of you checking to make sure the hallway was empty, placing both of your hands on the wooden pedestal and deliberately shoving it to the floor. That video file has already been submitted as Exhibit A in the civil filing you are currently holding. The smirk finally vanished from his face. His eyes darted down to the heavy packet of legal documents. But we did not stop at vandalism. Mitchell interjected smoothly, closing his briefcase. If you flip to the second page of that filing, you will see the secondary charge. We are suing you for active conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Terrence's jaw clenched. You have no proof of that. I told the detectives I was innocent. I have the high-definition video of you standing directly behind Sydney, rubbing her shoulders and actively encouraging her while she committed federal identity theft, I countered effortlessly. Furthermore, I have the enhanced audio recording of your midnight kitchen meeting, where you explicitly told Sydney to stick to the timeline to manipulate the squatter rights laws and force me out of my own home. You are an active, documented co-conspirator in a massive financial plot against my estate. I let the silence hang in the air for a brief second, allowing the sheer weight of the evidence to crash down on his shoulders. Then I delivered the final career-ending blow. "You work in finance, Terrence," I said, my voice turning to absolute ice. "You work in a highly regulated sector that relies entirely on compliance, ethical behavior, and pristine background checks. You handle multi-million-dollar corporate accounts." Terrence's breathing hitched. His hands began to visibly shake, crinkling the edges of the legal documents. "When this civil fraud conspiracy hits the public docket on Monday morning," I continued ruthlessly, "your firm compliance department will be instantly notified. Your regulatory license will be flagged. Your employer will see the high-definition video of you facilitating a $500,000 identity theft ring. When this hits your background check, your career in the financial sector is entirely over. You will be fired immediately. You will be permanently blacklisted from the industry. You will never legally handle another client money again for the rest of your life." The blood drained completely from Terrence's face. He went ghost pale, looking exactly like a man who had just been pushed out of an airplane without a parachute. The arrogant, upwardly mobile finance persona was completely annihilated. He realized I was not just suing him for a broken antique. I was legally and professionally destroying his entire identity. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to try to bargain his way out of his impending ruin, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The flashing red and blue lights from the federal vehicles cast sharp shadows across my manicured front lawn. I stood in the doorway of my kitchen, watching as the two plainclothes detectives firmly guided my husband and his daughter toward the exit. The steel handcuffs clicked metallically with every single step they took. David looked entirely defeated. His shoulders were hunched and his eyes were fixed firmly on the hardwood floor. He did not dare to look back at me. He finally realized there was absolutely no mercy left to extract from my bank accounts. Sydney, however, was still crying hysterically. Her makeup was smeared down her cheeks, completely ruining her carefully crafted social media aesthetic. She babbled incoherently about how this was all a mistake, begging the federal agents to let her call her followers, as if an online audience could somehow invalidate a federal fraud charge. They were escorted out of my house and placed into the back of separate government vehicles. With the primary architects of the heist securely detained, Mitchell turned his attention back to Terrence. The arrogant finance broker was still staring blankly at the civil lawsuit packet in his hands, completely paralyzed by the destruction of his career. Mitchell reached into his briefcase one final time and produced a single brightly colored legal document. "This is an emergency ex parte restraining order," Mitchell announced, his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the kitchen. "A family court judge signed it an hour ago based on the overwhelming evidence of your financial conspiracy and property destruction. You are legally required to vacate these premises immediately. You cannot come within 500 feet of my client or this estate." One of the uniformed local police officers who had arrived to assist the federal agents stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his utility belt. "You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your personal essentials," the officer stated loudly. "I will be escorting you upstairs, and I will be escorting you right back out. Move." Terrence did not argue. The horrifying realization that his career, his marriage, and his living situation had all been simultaneously obliterated left him physically shaking. He practically sprinted up the grand staircase with the officer right on his heels. I listened to the frantic sounds of drawers being yanked open and hangers clattering to the floor. The swift, panicked packing was a stark contrast to the entitled, arrogant swagger he had displayed when demanding my master bedroom just weeks prior. At exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I stepped out onto my front porch. The federal vehicles had already departed, leaving the neighborhood quiet once again. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing and watched the final act of my cleansing play out. Terrence emerged from the front door, sweating profusely and struggling under the weight of his belongings. He was dragging the exact same 2 massive suitcases down the driveway that he and Sydney had arrived with on that first chaotic midnight invasion. The heavy plastic wheels scraped loudly against the concrete. I watched with profound satisfaction as he hauled his luggage all the way to the curb, permanently banished from the luxury he had tried to steal. Because his premium credit cards were locked and his bank accounts were frozen from the bounced payments, he could not even call a luxury black car service. He was literally standing on the sidewalk waiting for the cheapest available rideshare to take him away from my property. Just as his ride pulled up, a white commercial van turned into my driveway. It was the emergency locksmith I had retained earlier in the day. Within 30 minutes, every single lock on the exterior doors of my $1.2 million estate had been completely replaced with high-security commercial deadbolts. I handed the locksmith my corporate card, paid the invoice in full, and locked my new heavy oak front door. The following Monday, Mitchell filed a comprehensive fault-based divorce petition. Because I had impenetrable, undeniable evidence of David attempting to commit federal mortgage fraud and identity theft against his own spouse, the judge completely bypassed any standard division of assets. The prenuptial agreement was aggressively upheld. The fault-based filing ensured I retained absolutely 100% of my property, my business, and my offshore investment accounts. David was explicitly denied any form of spousal support. He would be fighting his federal criminal charges with a court-appointed public defender, relying on the exact same legal system he had tried to weaponize against me. That evening, I walked into my immaculate, perfectly quiet kitchen. I opened a bottle of expensive red wine and poured myself a generous glass. I walked through the main hallway past the spot where the Ming vase had shattered and stepped into my master suite. The invasive ring lights were gone. My designer clothes were perfectly hung in the walk-in closet. The high-speed fiber optic internet was fully restored. I sat on the edge of my king-sized bed, took a slow sip of my wine, and smiled. My sanctuary was finally secure, entirely funded, and solely owned by me. My biggest lesson: never let anyone use the word family to bypass your boundaries. Have you ever caught a relative trying to manipulate your finances? Share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more. The harrowing story of Gwen dismantling her husband's calculated financial heist offers a masterclass in dealing with toxic, manipulative individuals. The most profound lesson we can extract from her ordeal is the absolute power of maintaining clinical composure over emotional reactivity when your boundaries are under attack. In toxic family dynamics, abusers often rely on provoking a chaotic emotional response. David, Sydney, and Terrence deliberately pushed Gwen's buttons, from hijacking her master bedroom to intentionally smashing a priceless antique vase. Their ultimate goal was to make her scream, cry, and lose control so they could brand her as mentally unstable and legally strip her of her hard-earned assets. Human instinct naturally urges us to yell, fight back, and defend our territory loudly. However, Gwen teaches us that explosive anger is a messy, unpredictable emotion that clouds judgment. By swallowing her immediate outrage, she completely neutralized their primary weapon. Instead of engaging in a pointless screaming match that would only validate their malicious gaslighting, Gwen chose silence, observation, and meticulous documentation. She let her abusers believe they were winning the territorial battle, while she quietly gathered undeniable concrete evidence of their federal crimes. Her ultimate victory was not achieved by arguing her worth or pleading for respect, but by letting her perpetrators' own arrogance and criminality seal their fate. This story powerfully reminds us that when dealing with manipulators who use the word family as a free pass for abuse, our best defense is airtight boundaries and indisputable facts. True strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly, gathering the evidence needed to protect its sanctuary. If you have ever had to protect your peace and assets from manipulative relatives, share your own strategies for setting unbreakable boundaries in the comments below.